Hello and welcome to the WIHS Journal, Public Affairs from 104.9 FM. I'm Paul Kretschmer. In the second of 2 days of conversation with Dr. Marilyn Singleton, who has issued a thesis entitled, Not All Black Lives Matter. As we pick up our conversation now, I'm completing an illustration about George Washington, who did many notable things, but also was an owner of slaves. But at the same time, he was a superior war hero. He was the first president of the United States. He willingly walked away from a military career, which was more or less foisted upon him at the beginning of the Revolution because people knew he had experience in that field. But when it was over, he walked away from it, rather unwillingly held political office for about 8 years, 2 terms of president, and even at that point, willingly walked away from all of that so that he could live in a quiet retirement life. But people don't talk about that when they talk about defacing or knocking heads off of Mount Rushmore, one of which is George Washington.
Oh, it's so silly, but just look at what happened where someone, we don't know who, or I don't know as of this phone call who did it, knocked down the statue of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass?
Yeah,
a runaway slave?
Yes.
My goodness. That's where it's like, what's wrong with these people? And they've already knocked down a statue of an abolitionist, and that just shows you that it's become kind of a cult mob where they aren't paying attention to who these folks are and are just acting out. And I don't know where that comes from, if it's from poor education, but this is not the way we want our society to go. And how is it that they're having restorative justice where we're supposed to give forgiveness to someone who just raped our child, yet we can't forgive someone who was the product of their times? And that's the other thing that we're not doing now. We have to look at these folks as products of the time. Do you remember back, not that you were alive then, what an odd way to say that, that back in the 1800s, it was okay for men to beat their wives. It was acceptable. And rumor has it that that's where the term rule of thumb came from, is that was the stick that you could beat your wife with as long as it wasn't any bigger than your thumb. Now, would we consider that normal behavior now? Of course not. And times change. And yes, you can say, how could anyone ever have a slave? People have had slaves since pre-biblical times. So whatever it is about human nature that wants us to be superior to somebody has evolved over time, as has our society evolved. We wouldn't consider having a slave now, but times have changed. You've raised an important point, which is to view people and events within the context of the world within which they occurred, not applying 21st century rules to people who lived in the early 1800s, the 19th century, because so much has changed between now and then, and people have called that sort of thing in the past apples and oranges sort of thing. I lived and worked for a couple of years in South Dakota, eastern South Dakota, and out in that area, it wasn't African Americans that were attacked or rude or even worse comments made about. It was Native Americans. I had a landlady for about a year out there, for instance, in the town of Mitchell, South Dakota, who routinely referred to Native American people who lived on the reservations out there as skins. And it was clear, by the way she said the word, that it was intended to be a derogatory or deprecatory. Not sure, didn't get that word out quite right, but in any case, it was intended to be a slam. It was not intended to be a reference of respect, but rather one of disrespect, most certainly. Absolutely, and what's very funny that you use the word skin. Now, where I grew up, one of the racial things you called Mexicans was skins, but that wasn't a mean thing to say. So all these things change, and there were non-mean terms for different racial groups that people could say to each other and not get beaten up. And, it's just sort of funny to me, having lived through the years and seen how these things change. And in my day, nobody would ever say the N-word, and not even black people. And then you listen to rap music now, and that's all they say. And, where did that come from?
I can certainly remember a time before I was 10 years old. I'm 64 going on 65 at the moment. I was under 10 years old until 1965. And yet I can remember reciting an old jingle that children used to recite. And the phrase included the N-word within the context of the sentence, grab a by their toe. See? And one day my mother heard me saying that, and she said, you can't talk like that. You can't talk like that.
And good for your mother. And it's the sort of thing, kids do stuff like that all the time.
Up until then, I didn't know that, but
one
of my elders did, and she pointed out that was not something that we could say with appreciation for someone else, but rather it was a derogatory way to refer to someone.
And the thing is, now, no one would even consider doing that. You wouldn't hear anyone doing that. There used to be a time that people would tell ethnic jokes at cocktail parties.
Yes.
In good company.
Yes.
That just doesn't happen anymore. So people do change. They do evolve, and you have to give our poor old folks from 300, 400 years ago a chance to be seen how they were living at that moment and what they did for our country to make us the country that we are today.
If we wish to be considered as people of goodwill, Doctor, how do we steer the conversation toward taking care of matters like removing statues, for instance, in southern states where the Confederacy was glorified? How can we re-steer the conversation so that it doesn't end up merely being a riot or vandalism or fires or people's livelihood being taken away because their business has been burned to the ground in the midst of anger over a justifiable anger, but at the same time we don't simply want to replicate the violence, but do something useful and salutary to correct something?
That's where the local leadership has to step up to the plate. I've been very disappointed hearing about the local leadership in some of these areas that right from the get-go, they need to stand up and say, this is not what you do. This is not how you seek change. We will listen to you. Maybe we haven't listened in the past, but our eyes are open now. And come to city council, come to whatever the local meetings or state meetings happen to be, and you give us a list of the statues you find offensive, and we're going to work on that way to get them out of the public square. And as many folks are now doing, and some have done in a very proactive way, where they have removed them, they have put them in historical places, but they're not in the public square, which implies that they condone that person's behavior.
Thank you so much for the generosity of your time at this point in the day, Dr. Singleton. It's been a pleasing moment to draw alongside your mind and converse with you.
Oh, it's always wonderful talking to you.
Dr. Marilyn Singleton, African-American physician, has been my guest for these 2 days of broadcasts. For further information, call us at 860-346-1049, 860-346-1049. The opinions expressed are those of the participants, not necessarily those of the staff or management of the station. I'm Paul Kretschmer on the WIHS Journal, Public Affairs from WIHS, Middletown.